giving us a sense of where Donald Trump came from. You know, what wave did he ride in on? And so I'm going to just take little snippets from the book and share those as a way of starting some conversations, I hope. For evangelicals, domestic and foreign policy are two sides of the same coin. Christian nationalism, which is a big topic for us, Christian nationalism, the belief that America is God's chosen nation and must be defended as such, serves as a powerful predictor of intolerance toward immigrants, racial minorities, non-Christians. It is linked to opposition to gay rights and opposition to gun control, to support for harsher punishments for criminals, to justifications for the use of excessive force against Black Americans in law enforcement, and to traditionalist gender ideology. Everything we care about, right? White evangelicals have pieced together this patchwork of issues and a nostalgic commitment to rugged, aggressive, militant white masculinity, serving as the thread binding them together into a coherent whole. A father's rule in the home is inextricably linked to heroic leadership on the national stage, and the fate of the nation hinges on both. Really puts it together quite wonderfully. By November 2016, the affinities were clear. A substantial number of white evangelicals shared Donald Trump's nationalism, Islamophobia, his racism, and nativism. They condoned his, quote, nasty politics. They agreed that injured protesters got what they deserved, that the country would be better off getting rid of bad apples, and that people were, quote, too sensitive about what was said in politics. Drawn to his populist appeals, white evangelicals demonstrated a preference for rejecting political compromise, for strong solidarity, leadership, and for breaking the rules when necessary. There you go. Well said, and certainly a lot of people in the media agreed, which is why the media gets fingered as part of the problem. In the book, a real important part of this that I hope we'll pay attention to each time is the picture of Jesus that comes out of this. In the evangelical world as compared to our way of looking at Jesus. However, she makes it clear that evangelicals look at Jesus in two ways and have had that look at Jesus two ways for a very long time. What sort of Jesus are they imagining? Is their Savior a conquering warrior? A man's man who takes no prisoners and wages holy war? That's the Jesus of the book Revelation. Or is he a sanctified lamb who offers himself up for the restoration of all things? How one answers this, how one answers these questions will determine what it looks like to follow Jesus. And our way is neither the sacrificial lamb or the Jesus who's the conquering hero on a white horse with a dripping sword dripping with blood. You know, we read the book, we read the Sermon on the Mount, right? And that's not the same as either of those two ways of looking at Jesus, which makes us strange and obviously invisible because she doesn't even mention us. Again, this book is interesting. It's written from the inside by Kristen Cobes-Dumez. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. But she teaches at Calvin College, right, in Grand Rapids. Is that where that is? The heart of old-style Reform Christianity. Okay. Just a couple of things more. I've been in the heart of this. No, I've not been in the heart of this. I've been on the edge of this all my ministry and have been fascinated by it. For conservative white evangelicals, The good news of the Christian gospel has become inextricably linked to a staunch commitment to patriarchal authority, gender difference, and Christian nationalism, and all of these are intertwined with white racial identity. Many Americans who now identify as evangelicals are identifying with this operational theology, one that is Republican in its politics and traditionalist in its values. This God and country faith is championed by those who regularly attend evangelical churches and by those who do not. It creates affinities across denominational, regional, and socioeconomic differences, even as it divides Americans and American Christians into those who embrace these values and those who do not. In this way, conservative white evangelicalism has become a polarizing force in American society. And it has become a money generator like crazy. We're talking about evangelical religion as a brand. And that really got going in the 60s or 70s, probably the 70s. Just took off. And what's interesting, they sell books and videos and DVDs and diets and purity rings, right? And Christian bling of every kind. Every kind. And when people leave the fold, and there have been important women who've left the fold, the first thing they do is tell the women that their Christian book distributors will not sell their books anymore. So I'm thinking of Rachel Held Evans, who's really important, the late, I have a quarrel with God. So why God took a 35-year-old beautiful former evangelical who was having such good work, peeling evangelicals off and bringing them to us, actually. She died a few years ago of the flu? Terrible. And another woman who I know more about, whose name is Jen Hatmaker, who was part of the evangelical movement and left it over the issue of LGBTQ plus issues, and was just raked over the coals everywhere as a traitor to the Bible. So I'll let you speak after I say these words. So just before COVID, in October 2019, I went to the University of Denver to the second installment of a conference that Rachel Held Evans booked before she died. But they held it anyway. And 3,000, mostly women in their 30s and 40s, came to this conference. I went to look. These were women who left their evangelical churches, churches where their pastors told those women that they needed to obey their husbands even if they got beat up at home, and who beat up their own families, turns out, in some cases as well. So these were, and these are also people, whose children came out as gay, and they said, well, I'm gonna choose my child over my church? Of course I am. Well, those are the ones who came to this conference. And there were 3,000 of them, and they were so happy, and their question was, what do we do now? We can't go back to our churches anymore. We'd like to go somewhere. We don't believe in God anymore. And so there were a lot of people there to give them hugs, and they gave each other hugs. It was a very powerful experience. And the person who spoke that amazed me was a woman named Jen Hatmaker, who I said was a 45-year-old at the time evangelical Christian who had left again over the issue of she had no argument anymore with gay people. And here's what she said at that conference. She said, if a church says women should not lead, what can we trust about them? And what can we trust about what they say about anything else? That was something she came to. And then she shared a scripture that she said helped her. And it was from Jesus, where he says, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit." This is after some words he had to say about judging and hypocrisy. So here's what she said. I wrote as quick as I could because this woman was really good. She said, "My first clue was I was on the right road and leaving the old evangelical church, was seeing and identifying bad fruit. I kept noticing that the doctrine in my church was right and correct. At least that's what the church always said. But the bad fruit I saw in that church too, that families were being destroyed and whole churches, and that the whole tree appeared then to maybe be rotten. Seeing good fruit was the second part of this. Seeing good fruit in politicians, my pastor said, were bad, like Barack Obama, who had no hint of scandal, a wonderful family, but her pastor called progressive people godless, and threw Barack Obama in there too. When looking at their good fruit, you couldn't deny that they had something, liberal churches. There is healing where there is good fruit, and there is no way to spin it differently. So who decides what good fruit and bad fruit is? She said she'd grown up a Southern Baptist, and that she was right and good and saved and correct. And she was taught that everyone else was wrong and bad and unsaved and incorrect. And she'd been a head cheerleader, of course she had. And she brought her Bible to school every day, and she thought of herself as good fruit working for a pretty tough God. She said, I worked really hard to weaponize the Bible and use it to gaslight non-Christians, calling them all bad. She felt her Western white church experience was biblical and guaranteed by the Bible. She said, instead, I have learned the first and most important step to rightly discern good fruit from bad fruit is uncentering the powerful majority from the good news. The Bible was written by oppressed people for oppressed people, and how I ever believed that white Western male straight rich people had the truth was crazy. Which is so amazing. It didn't take her, she only left the church in 2016, so she's gotten all this since. Even the white people belong, she says, but their place is not at the center. When those are flourishing and they are at the center, then they are there as a result of only the white rich people are flourishing, then they're there at the center as a result of the oppressed. The oppressed are paying for it. If a white male, this is the thing, if a white male pastor gets to keep his pulpit because a woman in his church has 2 black eyes, because her husband thinks it's okay to hit her, due to his pastor's sermon, this is death. That was the story of these women. I heard it over and again. Their husbands felt empowered in the worst way possible by the pastors, male pastors, of these churches. So, and then at the end she apologized. She said something effective, I want to apologize to all the gay people here for what I said and have done against you all these years. It's like, wow, that was really powerful. So that's outside the book, but it's what the book is really about. So let me just stop there. We can get to the basics of the history, beginning with like Billy Sunday. But before that, let's just share what you're all thinking about this. I'll get closer. Amy, I think, has something. Oh, no, you're just reaching your coat. Okay. Whoop.
I just finished watching season 5 of Handmaid's Tale, so this is very appropriate right now.
What did you see?
Just finished watching the 5th season of Handmaid's Tale.
Oh, right.
Frightening.
Oh, Di over here. Oh, there's a couple.
Oh, I just want to say it sounds like a cult.
Right. Yeah.
Just a quick thing. One of the first incidents in my life that made me stop and think, wait, what am I doing with my religion, was years ago in my medical office. One of the other physicians had a conversation with his really closely held, and we had close relationships with our medical assistants. His assistant happened to be Shia. And she told me this later, that one day he had been having this proselytizing conversation with her, and she said, "Do you mean to tell me that even though I go to mosque and I pray and I love my family, because I don't believe in Jesus and have the same faith you do, that I'm going to hell?" And he said, "Yes, that's right." And I thought, this is the wrong place for me. That can't be right. That can't be God's intent.
I did a little writing many years ago trying to summarize some of these differences, and one of the things I came to is that people don't get about evangelicalism and its effect on politics is that evangelicalism is all about it's very dualistic. You are in or you are out. And it's all about who's in and who's out. And there's no nuance to that. There's no gray area. It's figuring out where that circle ends that you are definitely inside of and trying to figure out who's in it and who's out.
I have two siblings who grew up in the same household my other brother and I did, and who are very, very, very right-wing, homophobic. And part of the reason I think they were drawn to it, it is very black and white. They like not having to make those choices, having those choices made for them, but it's very hard.
Some of you know I lived in West Africa for 7 years, and I just feel there are many paths to God. And I did a junior choir in the Methodist Church, and I worshiped as a Presbyterian, basically, but we attended Mass on Sundays at the mission, the Catholic mission. It was wonderful, because he did a real short sermon that was translated at the time. Then we went and had coffee and goodies and stuff afterwards with him, or with whatever priests were there. And they were our friends, and they were our cohorts, and they supported us in anything we possibly could. And I just appreciated the fact that it didn't have to be one thing or another, or very evangelical, because there was a lot of other stuff besides. There was animistic activities and all other kinds of things that were going on. But you accepted and loved people one by one. And that was the important thing. Like I accepted and enjoyed Ken's playing today.
You were in a special
Blew
place. Let me give you some of the background history. For American Christians, the challenge was to reconcile this aggressive new masculinity, which was taking hold in the beginning of the century, partly due to Theodore Roosevelt, who, was a little short guy with a high voice, but who put on a cowboy hat and lived in, South Dakota for a while, and brought masculinity to the masses. With its emphasis on gentility and restraint. Let's see, wait a minute. I'll start again. For American Christians, the challenge was to reconcile this aggressive new masculinity with traditional Christian virtue, with its emphasis on gentility and restraint. Victorian Christianity suddenly seemed insufficiently masculine. Virile, aggressive men could hardly be expected to submit themselves to such emasculating faith. And so in the 1910s, Christian men set out to re-masculinize American Christianity, seeking to offset the, quote, womanly virtues that had come to dominate the faith. They insisted that Christianity was also essentially masculine, militant, warlike. It was time for men to take back the church. Yikes. But Southern evangelicals found a way to define Christian manhood in a way that sanctified aggression, to maintain order and fulfill their role as protectors. There were times when Christian men must resort to violence, In the early 20th century then, a rugged American masculinity united northern and southern white men and transformed American Christianity. Former baseball player Billy Sunday preached this new Christian masculinity with unrivaled zeal, wanting nothing to do with a sissy-livered piety. Sunday preferred to pack his old muzzle-loading gospel gun with ipecac, buttermilk, rough on rats, whatever that is, rock salt, and whatever else came in handy, and let it fly. Is there a picture? Do we have a picture of Billy Sunday? Oh, there he is. He has this fist all the time. He's always coming through with his fist. And then please show the next picture of the other Billy, or one of the other Billys. There he is. And Billy Graham did the same thing. And he used the same choreography, at least to begin with. I think he outgrew that. He outgrew it. But he started with the Billy Sunday as his model. All right. Truman comes along. Harry Truman, this is a long ways. I'm kind of jumping around here. But, years later, Harry Truman comes along, and he has his own version of masculinity, and he calls for universal military training in the late 40s, early 50s. And some among evangelicals who were still in the old, milder-mannered school said that, oh my God, if all men became trained by the military, it would undermine them morally because everybody knows what men do when they go to the Marine Corps, which is really fascinating. That certainly has fallen away since then completely, but it was alive once. Billy Graham comes along right after World War II, and interesting, this book tells us that early on, when he was coming out of seminary, he was very influenced by historical, critical readings of the Bible. And he realized that the Bible was not without error and had to make a decision. Either he said that and lost all following he had, or he sucked it up, went along with those who believed that the Bible had no errors, and used that as a platform to do all his conversions. And he went with, obviously, the conversion platform and got away from what he actually believed. And what his wife, I think, believed till she died. She was Presbyterian, as a matter of fact, right? He was interesting. He was on both sides of every issue at one time or another, which is interesting. At one point, he talked about wives needing to subject themselves to men who were heads of households and protectors and providers. He was just right with that movement that came up. But he was also a Democrat. But he was a Democrat because he's from North Carolina, right? And all North Carolinians are Democrats. But he met with Truman, and it didn't go well. Harry Truman didn't do a nice job with Billy Graham, according to the book. And Billy Graham kind of ended up humiliated because of it. And later, Graham criticized Truman's firing of General MacArthur, right, for insubordination. And so that led to Eisenhower wisely seeing an opening and befriending Billy Graham and bringing him and most of the South over with him, I guess, eventually, at the same time. So that in 1954, Congress passes the One Nation Under God phrase that's added to the Pledge of Allegiance, right? Which I didn't know growing up wasn't there all the time. 54, before you were born. Okay, let's see what I got here. Nixon comes along and he, not only welcomes Graham, they become best buddies, right? To the point where Billy Graham, God bless his soul, apologized pretty much to the nation for hitching his wagon to Nixon after the Watergate scandal, right? And Reagan was Reagan. How did I get him and Billy Graham mixed up? I'm not sure. Billy Graham, God bless him, did a lot and was very outspoken against nuclear aggression and called for disarmament. I mean, he was just like, really? Yes. He was very outspoken about it, which, of course, confused the people who followed him. He also integrated his crusades early on, very early on, and praised the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. He had wonderful, common sense, maybe? What's that? He made some money, but I never sensed that he made, he did make a lot of money, but I didn't think he ever lived high on the hog. To white Americans who were willing to listen, the civil rights movement argued that America had never been a country of liberty and justice for all. This is interesting. Evangelicals' response to civil rights varied, particularly in the early stages of the movement. It is easily forgotten, but some evangelicals, especially those who would come to constitute the evangelical left, were vocal supporters of civil rights. Others, primarily fundamentalists and Southerners, were staunch opponents. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the lost cause of the Confederate South had blended with Christian theology to produce a distinctly Southern variation of civil religion, one that upheld Robert E. Lee as its patron saint. In this tradition, fundamentalist pastors like W.A. Criswell of First Baptist Church crusaded against integration as, quote, denial of all that we believe. To such opponents, civil rights activism was a sign of disruption and disorder. Many denounced Martin Luther King Jr. as a communist agitator. Most Northern evangelicals were somewhere between these two positions. Like Graham, many were cautious supporters in the early years of civil rights. In the early 50s, Graham began to integrate his crusades, going as far as to personally remove ropes separating the seating between whites and blacks. In 1954, he praised the Brown versus Board of Education ruling. I said that. In 1957, he invited Martin Luther King Jr. to pray at his New York crusade. Yet Graham was wary about moving too fast, and he urged the Supreme Court to proceed with caution and to quell, quote, the extremists on both sides. After passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, these differences within the evangelical community began to diminish. Explicit support for segregation fell out of favor, even among stalwart fundamentalists, as was the case for most segregationists more generally. At the same time, moderate proponents of civil rights began to cool in their support for further action. Graham, for example, withdrew his backing as activists began to engage in civil disobedience and demand further government intervention. Many evangelicals followed his lead, concluding that it was not the role of government to interfere in issues of racial justice. Only Jesus could change human hearts. Think about that. Many evangelicals, too, found it hard to accept that the sin of racism ran deep through the nation's history. To concede this seemed unpatriotic. Having embraced the idea of America as a Christian nation, it was hard to accept a critique of the nation as fundamentally as that advanced by the civil rights movement, as fundamental, you know. Understanding this ambivalence toward civil rights within white evangelicalism is key to understanding the role that race would play within evangelical politics more generally. By backing away from their support for civil rights, evangelicals like Billy Graham ended up giving cover to more extremist sentiments within the insurgent religious right. Got it. Comments? Questions?
I sort of remember thinking at the time that he was ailing, that maybe that the evangelicals would lose their leader, and there would be more open discussion. But obviously that vacuum was filled by a lot of other people.
Right, good point.
And he also, I seem to recall, in his last years, moderated quite a bit.
Mhm. I think that's true, which makes it so strange that his son, Franklin, is so the opposite. But you know, the children have to be different from their dads for some reason. That's such a fascinating part of this, isn't it? She doesn't mention Sojourners Magazine and Jim Wallace, who really represents the evangelical left wing that's still alive. It's on life support, maybe, I don't know.
A lot of these super pastors really got into trouble over sexual innuendo and problems, and it really, I'm not sure it's in this first 100 pages or exactly where in the book, but that has played itself out now. We don't seem to run into the problem with more of these leaders being disreputable in some shape or form. And I'm wondering, I mean, it may not be sexual innuendo, but other sorts of things in leadership roles that really is being accepted, is not being, they aren't chastised for their indiscretions, no matter what.
Other reflections on that one?
Well, when you put Donald Trump at the head of the whole thing as the savior, it's pretty hard to hold somebody who does that sort of thing in any kind of low esteem.
I was just thinking about these evangelical ministers and their sermons to their congregations. And it seems like pushing some of these ideas that you've just mentioned and we've talked about are so much in conflict with other parts of the Bible. I mean, are they just ignore parts of Jesus' life and teachings and sermons that don't fit with what they're talking about? I mean, how do they get away with that?
Right. Well, we do the same. We say we ignore the parts of the New Testament where Jesus says that we might go to the lake of fire where the worm dieth not, because I don't believe in hell. Now, of course, I nuance that by saying that was added later by somebody else who had a problem. Jesus never would have said that. But, the argument's on me to say I'm shouting in the dark to an evangelical. So, but you're absolutely right. They ignore what I think is half to 2/3 of the Bible, which is about social justice.
I'm going to add to what Wayne was saying here about the whole way that American Christianity relates to morality and the public morality has shifted so much in my lifetime, because it used to be that the Presbyterian churches and the other mainstream churches tried to speak with some moral authority on the issues that face the day. I was a General Assembly commissioner in 1986, and we were dealing with all of these papers discussing this issue, nuclear disarmament or this or that, and people actually paid attention, some people did, to what, say, the General Assembly published a paper about something, and they were generally thoughtful, and they, paid attention to what people on all sides of the issue were saying. And somewhere along the line, the Christian church as a whole has lost its moral authority in the United States. It doesn't seem to play any kind of role in our public policy anymore, and it's on the right, I think they've shifted to where pretty much anything goes as long as you vote against abortion. Everything else is okay. And there's no moral authority in anything that Christians do as Christians, to my mind.
Right. Two things, that very quickly, you're right, abortion's the big deal, and it's what evangelical pastors are still pointing to Donald Trump and saying, he gave us that. He also, and this is important, though it doesn't mean a thing to me, moved the ambassador, what's it called? Embassy, right, the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which they see as a step toward bringing Jesus back. The end time. So it goes back to last week's discussion, which is really important. Those are the two things that get pointed to. That's all he's got. And the one of them doesn't mean a thing. Anyway, what are you going to do? Okay.
So in going back to our talking about from fundamentalist view of the Bible, what I have seen is they don't study the Bible, but their children memorize entire books of the Bible for competitions.
Well, I think they have, yeah, really. I've been actually up to Western Seminary a number of times and heard speakers back years ago. They're very smart people. They read the Bible. They look at these things very carefully. They look at it, through their lens. I look at it through mine. We have different presuppositions that we stand on when we read it. So I'd say they're just as smart as our guys and our women. We have a lot of women. They have very few. I'll say that. But it's just different.
One additional thing, going back over years, there are evangelicals that have stood out in terms of social rights and even more recently on climate change. We have some very outstanding people. And it seems to me that we don't have in my perception, we don't have a big dialogue going with these sorts of folks. And it seems to me that if there is to be any kind of coalition or any kind of common understanding and mutual commitment to some issues, it would be with those folks. And that I don't know how, because I'm not involved with the ecumenical stuff very much, whether or not whether or not perhaps we see that as being strengthened in any way through all this challenge, because that seems to me a good talking point.
I would think you might be onto something there that who knows how it's going to fall out. The evangelical church is fragmenting to a degree. We'll see what happens in the next 2 years. Let me go on to a couple of other issues that are just as important and sometimes get more headlines than the one about race. I'll start with page 53 here in the book. Oops, where to go? All right. This comes from a book by Jack Hyles, who was a mega church pastor, that he wrote in 1972, a book called How to Rear Children, okay? So child rearing. Hyles' book includes a section on how to make a man out of a boy. Got it? Boys needed to be taught to be winners. Quote, "This is how we get our General MacArthurs." "This is how Billy Sundays are made," unquote. Teaching boys how to be good losers left you with a generation of young men who didn't want to fight for their country and were instead, quote, "willing to let the stronger nation on earth bow down in shame before a little nation like North Vietnam," unquote. It was up to Christian parents to rear a new generation of men, and to this end, they should make boys, quote, "play with boys and with boys' toys and games, with guns, cars, baseballs, basketballs, and footballs," unquote. Boys who engaged in, quote, "feminine activities," unquote, he warned, often ended up as homosexuals. A boy must be taught to fight to be rugged enough to defend his home and those he loved. Hiles bought his own son a pair of boxing gloves when he was 5, an air rifle at 13, and a .22 at 15. When a neighbor boy insulted Hiles' daughter, he encouraged his son to let him have it and walked away as his son beat the boy bloody. Such violence was sanctified, quote, "God pity this weak-kneed generation which stands for nothing, fights for nothing, and dies for nothing." We kind of forget that stuff.
That was during that time when women were accused of making their sons homosexual by loving them too much and catering to them too much. And
That's in the book too, yeah.
horrible.
Wow. So you should take your kids to see John Wayne movies. That's early on, right? He was... In a 1971 interview in Playboy, Wayne was particularly harsh in his assessment of, quote, the blacks, or colored, or whatever they want to call themselves. They certainly aren't Caucasian, he said. This is hard on the ears. He says, with a lot of blacks, there's quite a bit of resentment along with their descent, and possibly rightly so. But we can't all of a sudden get down on our knees and turn everything over to the leadership of the blacks. I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. 1971, he said this. I don't believe in giving authority and positions of leadership and judgment to irresponsible people. God. As far as African American representation in his films, Wayne asserted that he'd, quote, given the blacks their proper position. He had, quote, a black slave in the Alamo, and he had, quote, a correct number of blacks in the Green Berets. His views on Native Americans were no more enlightened. Quote, I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from the Native Americans. He didn't say that. He said Indians, I'm sure. Our so-called stealing of this country from them was just a matter of survival. People needed land, quote, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. Let's go home and selfishly keep our houses to ourselves, right? Oh, God. Anyway, that's where John Wayne comes in. Fear had been at the heart of evangelical post-war politics, and that's post-World War II politics. A fear of godless communism and a fear that immorality would leave Americans defenseless. What changed by the 1960s was evangelicals' sense of their own power. Between the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the 1960s, evangelicals had become more and more confident that they had a providential role to play in the strengthening of American defenses and upholding American faithfulness. The events of the 60s, however, and the realization that the larger culture seems to scorn what they had to offer undercut their newfound confidence. Among evangelicals, a rhetoric of fear would persist, though it would be aimed at internal threats as much as external ones. Instrumental to their efforts to reclaim power, this rhetoric of fear would continue to bolster the role of heroic masculine protector. There might be a place for the softer virtues, but the perilous times necessitated ruthless power. In the words of Baptist scholar Alan Bean, quote, the unspoken mantra of post-war evangelicalism was simply, Jesus can save your soul, but John Wayne can save your ass. Some people like that. Okay. Shall we go on to the book Total Women? That's a fun one. Okay. Maribel Morgan, do we have the picture of that? Oh, I'm sorry, I should have sent you that. I did. Maribel Morgan, very nice lady from what I can tell. And this book comes out, what, same time? Early 70s? 73. Book was especially important for working women because a man's masculinity may be threatened by your paycheck, a woman's paycheck. A wife needed to let her husband know that he was her hero, and it was her job to put her husband's tattered ego back together at the end of each day by admitting his masculine qualities, his muscles or whiskers. Oh, admiring them. Morgan's advice had a religious foundation. The biblical remedy for marital conflict was the submission of wives to husbands. It was God's plan for women to be under a husband's rule. But Marable Morgan mostly drew on her own experience, particularly when it came to questions of intimacy, a topic about which she had much to say. To begin with, it was important for women to keep up their curb appeal. To look and smell delicious, to be feminine, soft, and touchable, not dumpy, stringy, or overexhausted. Oh my God. At least if they wanted husbands to come home to them. But that was just the beginning. To keep a husband's interest, Morgan was a strong believer in the power of costumes in the bedroom or kitchen, living room, or backyard hammock. So that when a husband opened the front door each night, it was like opening a surprise package. One day, quote, a smoldering sex pot, another an all-American fresh beauty, a pixie, a pirate, a cowgirl, or a showgirl. Contrary to popular belief, Marable Morgan never recommended that women clothe themselves in nothing but saran wrap. She wasn't, and meet her husband at the door. She wasn't sure where that rumor got its start, though she conceded it was a great idea. Oh, God. I'm sure saran wrap sales went up in the 70s. Okay. Is there more to that? I'm not sure. Oh, there's one more little bit. By giving husbands what they wanted, women could transform marriage from, quote, an endurance contest into something enjoyable. And they could keep men at home, which was good for women and good for their kids, especially their boys. They're boys, right? If a father was absent, a boy might start to identify too much with his mother. That's where it was. And begin to develop certain feminine qualities on a subconscious level, opening the door to homosexuality. There we go. So it sort of puts this all together, doesn't it? She does a good job of reminding us. Go ahead. Oh, you found it. Oh, good. Yeah. Oh, my God, good job. That's a book that came out after Total Woman. Total Woman was 73. I'm not sure when that next book was. No, that was Total Woman. No, Phyllis did other. Phyllis is really interesting. She's a little like Billy Graham. Yeah, Phyllis Schlafly liked gay men. She really threw a monkey wrench into the evangelical works. Yeah. Okay, yeah, let's get the microphone to June.
What's really scary is these are the years when I was growing up, and it's like I was surrounded with that BS.
And Dobson telling us to beat our children.
It never ceases to amaze me how these women come along and become prominent and write books and make all this money out of an environment that says they shouldn't do that. I mean, there's an inherent contradiction in writing a book like that, or as becoming a Supreme Court justice, even though you're a member of an extremely conservative Christian group that doesn't believe women should do certain things, and yet be applauded by everybody for achieving that.
But that's okay, because she had 6 children, 5
6
children,
children
some
before
huge
she
number
died,
of
yeah.
children.
Is that right?
I want to tag on to what June just said. The era that I was growing up, so I was a sophomore. I just finished my sophomore year in college. I was living in California, and John Briggs was a state legislature, later, and he had this initiative that was going to, it was going to be on the ballot, and it would not allow any LGBTQ person to work in the public school system. And I had just completed year 2 of my elementary education path. And so here during the summer, I'm kind of freaking out, and I wasn't out to anybody. I was going to Point Loma Nazarene College, so I was really in, my own box. And then besides the initiative, and then lost my train of thought. The Evangelical Promise Keepers was going on. My dad got me by the arm and said, we're going to this, and he probably knew I was gay at the time, but he figured this might be a fix to be around a bunch of evangelical Christian men. So that was pressure point. And then the other one was, lost that thought too. Darn. What I want to say is all of these things were bombarding me, and I was shrinking inside as a person. And oftentimes, men and women, trans people, during these pressure point times, this is when suicide seems like a viable option, because everything else is working against you. And all I'm going to say is I'm thankful I'm here today, say the story, and survived the evangelical movement in my own house, because I was in the Nazarene, parsonage with my mom and dad. But I'm glad I survived, and you too, June.
We are too. Gosh. All right.
I guess I'd say one thing about what you were reading that John Wayne said.
Yeah.
Is it really that different from what his buddy Ronald Reagan thought?
They were two peas, right? Same pod. Does the name Bill Gothard mean anything to anybody here? Because maybe a little bit, yeah. I actually went to the Institute of Basic Youth Conflicts because I wanted to know what the hell was going on. And it was interesting. This is somebody who came up in the 60s, who's still alive as far as I know, who was very black and white. I mean, this man was absolutely black and white. And he had this thing with this strange name eventually. It's a name that evolved into Institute of Basic Youth Conflicts. It has nothing to do with that. Here's what it says here. Bill Gothard believed that most problems could be solved by submitting to the proper authorities in each domain of life. Again, this is why all these women in evangelical churches are hiding under tables, because their husbands have been empowered to have this authority over them. Okay. To this end, he advanced the idea of a divinely ordained chain of command, similar to that of the military. In the family, the father was the ultimate authority. A wife owed her husband total submission, requiring approval for even the smallest household decisions. And children owed parents absolute obedience in both action and attitude. The church was also part of the proper functioning of society, and church leaders were to wield absolute God-given authority over members. Government, too, administered divinely sanctioned authority, with national leaders exercising authority over local officials, who in turn exercise authority over citizens. Proper authority structured business as well. The employer wielded God-given authority over employees. In this way, proponents of the biblical law married traditional gender roles to unrestrained free market capitalism. It was the match made in heaven. I went to, go ahead. Oh, you did go to it.
When you said that, I was like, it was
A whole week-long thing.
It was, yes, it was like 4 or 5 nights or something like that. And it was this, I remember thinking, I didn't know how liberal I was at the time. I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and this is a friend of mine. I think I was looking for more interaction with young adults. A friend of mine invited me, and I went. And every day I kept going just because, kind of a commitment to the friend. And every day my mouth would open wider in horror with what I was being heard and thinking, you guys believing this stuff? You are so different than I am. I had no idea.
So woke
And
you
when
up.
I was done, I thanked her for inviting me. They sent you home with this huge loose
Binder.
leaf binder. And it was awful. I think it was hard to get out of it.
Yeah.
You know, because they were going to follow up with you. And I think I finally said, I have my own church. I'm fine. Thank you. I'll go back to that. But I just remember that was when I knew I was a liberal.
I went to it because I went to like 1981. I'd become pastor of one of our Presbyterian churches in the Cully neighborhood, actually. And almost everybody in the church had gone to this thing. So I went to it so I know what they were exposed to. And then I came back and I was a little horrified, like you were, except I go into houses of these people and bring this up, and the husband would say, yeah, I'm in charge, aren't I? I get to make the decisions. And I knew very well he never made a decision. His wife made all the decisions. I knew that in 99 out of 100 cases, these people were going to be fine. They paid their money, they went to the thing, they absorbed it all, they thought it was a great idea, and then they lived their lives. And in no case do I know did any woman ever get beaten up because of it, personally. But obviously it happens. And maybe it happens more now than it did then.
My parents had a needlepoint thing on their wall that says, I am the master of this house. Whatever my wife says will be done.
Right. That's good. Right. One more, and then we'll let you go. This is the last one is James Dobson, who's gotten a lot more. Bill Gothard's brother went to jail for preying on members, and then Bill Gothard at least was, if not indicted, at least brought up on suspicion. I mean, the whole thing did fall apart like a house of cards because he was improper with 15-year-old girls too. So there is that sometimes comes from these things. So James Dobson, more dangerous yet. It's page 82. In 1975, Dobson took it upon himself to articulate the, quote, critical difference between men and women. Okay, there's another piece of this. Males and females, he said, differ biochemically, anatomically, and emotionally. In truth, they are unique in every cell of their bodies, he said. He portrayed the distinction in stark terms. Men like to, quote, hunt and fish and hike in the wilderness, while women preferred to, quote, stay at home and wait for them. I can't believe that's in the book. Men played sports as women watched, yawning on the sidelines. He put that in there, yawning on the sidelines. But perhaps the most profound difference between men and women, according to Dobson, was their source of self-esteem. Quote, men derive self-esteem by being respected. Women feel worthy when they are loved. 5 years later, in his book, Straight Talk to Men and Their Wives, he expanded on this theme. Echoing Maribel Morgan, he explained that because of a man's fragile ego and, quote, enormous need to be respected, unquote, together with the woman's vulnerability and need to be loved, it was, quote, a mistake to tamper with the time-honored relationship of husband as loving protector and wife as recipient of that protection. And the thing about Dobson was that he politicized his stuff tremendously and never admitted that that's what he did to this day. Yeah. Yeah, there was mostly about raising children and disciplining them, not being afraid to. Oh, he actually had this thing where he said you should take your, I remember this, you should take your fingers and pinch the child in the neck thing until they fall over, and then you had them. It's terrifying, isn't it? Yeah. So it gets people. It gets a lot of us in a place where we just get really upset. June?
Be grateful for the progress we've made because we don't have to kowtow to that viewpoint. and we can be independent and responsible.
Are more of us feeling that way now? I hope so. Did you hear what June said about us? We should express gratefulness that most of us in this country don't live that way or believe that stuff. Or what were you saying?
I don't either.
Oh, you're saying at least you're glad that we do. Yeah. Oh, that's a good point, yeah. Sorry.
I have relatives who are in that old world still. But I'm just grateful that I escaped with the values that I have, and that I'm at home here and not somewhere else in Trump land, you know? Because I think there's a lot of people in this country who have not progressed to the point that we have.
Yeah.
That's why we're called progressive.
Right. You may know that, Judy has something. You may know that the Methodists, I mentioned in the sermon that the Methodists are about ready to split kind of down the middle over the gay ordination issue, and you must wonder why in the world that is. And maybe most of you know, but some of you probably don't. They have a lot of churches in Africa, and Africa as a culture, I mean, you can't say Africa is a culture, it's a million cultures, but somehow it's overwhelmingly anti-gay. I don't understand it, but that's the case. And so all of these Methodist churches in Africa have a vote in the United Methodist Church, and they're saying there's no way they're going to stand for gay ordination. So that's why that denomination, though it's overwhelmingly fine with gay ordination in the United States, is not when you total other churches. So we got to pray for them.
I was just going to say that I think the journey to get to where we are is a long and twisted one. You know, I grew up in probably a very traditional Presbyterian church in Long Beach, California, and I remember dating someone who didn't believe in God, and he was going to have to go back to his parents, and he was in the Navy, and tell his parents he didn't believe in God. And it started me on a journey where I asked everybody what they believed in, people I'd known forever. What is your belief? Tell me what you really believe. And it ended up, I saw Billy Graham's picture there, I ended up going to a rally in Anaheim, California, going down on the field to "O Lamb of God, I come," which is what they always sing.
Yeah, just
and it
as
was
I
a
am.
statement, and then they tried to follow up with me, you know, and they want to, you know, convert you. And I thought, no, I'm good, but it was a statement of faith to go down there and go,
Yeah.
I believe in a higher power, I'm good, I have my own beliefs, and Bill Gothard was probably part of that. And I imagine most people in here had a similar stuff where you turn left and you turn right, and that's why, you know, being here is so incredible because of everything that goes on here and the people that are here. It's wonderful.
But I really wish the evangelical world would look back at the life of Billy Graham and listen and look at everything he said and did. He was a very good man. I mean, God bless him. He had a hard thing, and I don't know. Well, it got out of hand. It got out of hand. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say my parents were both born in the 1920s, and were very progressive people. They grew up in the Mennonite church, but very progressive people. But I remember having lots of conversations over decades with my dad about Billy Graham, because there were things about him that my father held in very high esteem, and there were things about him, stands that he took, that my father could not get behind at all. But whenever I would walk through and he'd be watching him on television, I was like, Billy Graham again, you know.
But he couldn't not watch.
He had good hearts,
Yeah.
like most of us do.
Yeah. Crystal Cathedral, that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
I don't think he even gets does he get a mention in here? I'm not sure.
I keep hearing the voice of Betty Greer. Do you remember Betty Greer?
Yes.
She died recently at 102.
Yeah.
She was one of the pillars of this presbytery.
Right.
And I remember her saying at a presbytery meeting when some conservative folks were going, you know, about what amounted to nostalgia for the 1950s and 60s, and Betty going, There's a lot of us who aren't nostalgic for the 50s and 60s. Thank you very much.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, we'll let you go. It's been a full hour. Thank you for spending all this extra time. Next week, we're going to look at pages 100 to 200. Yeah. No, that's not true. We're taking a break because of the annual meeting, which won't last an hour. I'm almost sure of it. But then we'll pick it up 2 Sundays from now after worship and look at pages 100 to 200. Hang in there. Watch the news, see if any of this resonates, okay? And come back. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. It's called Jesus and John Wayne.
I heard somebody say, I think on CNN several years ago, that just really stuck with me, is if you go back just to about the 1970s and look at polls showing attitudes of evangelical Christians about political issues, black evangelicals and white evangelicals were virtually identical.
Yeah.
And look how far apart they are now.
It's amazing that they were this close together as they were. But then, I think at that time, black evangelicals, excuse me, they were